Good morning, everybody. This is day two of Urban Arc. Warm welcome to everyone who has joined here in person and online. My name is Tanvi Bhatikar. I am here with the IHS Research Office, and I'm really excited to be chairing this panel, which is called Scaling Control, Infrastructure and Governance. We have three papers today. Unfortunately, two of our panelists had to drop out for personal reasons. But these three are a really diverse set of papers that look at how urban and regional governance is being shaped through mega infrastructure projects, through water infrastructure, and through the judiciary, and across different scales. The first paper today looks at how industrial corridors are rescaling governance by creating corridors of control and exclusion. The second looks at water infrastructure in peripheral settlements to show how access is produced through everyday practice of repair and negotiation. And the third paper discusses how judicial and heritage based interventions produce urban peripheries in Chandigarh. With that, I think we'll begin. We have three speakers who are joining us online, and Christopher here is in person. Since there are three papers, we have a little more time for the speakers, so everybody has been given 15 minutes. Anshika, Yogita, and Ruchika, just keep an eye out on the chat box, and you'll see that you'll get 5 minutes time before you end. With that, I would like to invite the first speaker, who is Anshika Sharma. She's from Sabhyataa Consultancy Services. Her paper is titled Corridors of Control, Rescaling Power Through Mega Infrastructure and the Infrastructural State. Over to you, Anshika.
Hello, uh, good morning, everyone. I'm an architect, urban designer, and infrastructure strategist. And I'll just quickly begin my presentation. So, this paper examines a simple but under theorized shift in India's development trajectory. Mega infrastructure corridors are no longer just projects, they are governing instruments. My central claim is corridors operate as scalar technologies. They organize authority, planning, and citizenship by selectively stretching and compressing scale. Rather than asking what corridors build, I ask what do corridors do to the state, to planning, and to everyday life. Since 2014, India has announced 11 plus national industrial and economic corridors. Bharatmala alone involves 34,800 kilometers of highway with an investment of over 5.3 lakh crore. In 2021, PM Gati Shakti institutionalized this shift by integrating 16 ministries onto a single spatial platform. What matters here is not scale alone, but how scale is governed. Corridor planning increasingly bypasses municipal and even state planning processes, relocating decision making upward and outward. Infrastructure in this moment becomes a way of governing territory, not simply servicing it. We already have strong scholarship showing that infrastructure is not neutral. Larkin shows its effective power, Appel shows its promises, Brenner and Swijendorf show how scale is politically produced. In India, post liberalization critiques, Datta, Watson have examined smart cities and entrepreneurial urbanism. But there's a gap. Corridors are still treated as projects, not as scalar instruments. Logistics is discussed as efficiency, not governance. And Indian corridor urbanism remains conceptually under-theorized. This paper intervenes here by framing corridor as active mechanisms that reorganize scale itself. I use term infrastructural state to describe a mode of governance where infrastructure itself becomes statecraft. Authority is exercised here through visibility, which is done through dashboards, acceleration through speed and timelines, and alignment through interministerial coordinations. From this emerges my core concept. corridors of control. These are supra territorial formations, neither local nor national, that centralize decisions, fragment accountability, and quietly rescript citizenship through land, mobility, and compensation regimes. Methodologically, this is an interpretive, multi-scalar study. I analyzed policy documents from 2013 to 2023, including LARR Act, National Logistics Policy, and Gati Shakti platform materials. Institutionally, I examined bodies like DMI-CDC, formed in 2008 but significantly empowered post 2014. I also draw on PILs and environmental cases alongside spatial readings of corridor notes, land pooling zones, and investment regimes. The analysis moves across national, regional, and local scales because that's where governance is now happening. Empirically, we see a clear shift. Master plans are no longer binding instruments. Instead, spatial governance now operates through GIS dashboards, logistic grids, and performance metrics. Municipalities are repositioned as implementation units, not planning authorities. SPVs, the special purpose vehicles, play a key role here. What is produced is not decentralization, but reworked authority, centralized through projects rather than institutions. Power here is not only administrative, it is aesthetic. The Gati Shakti platform visualizes India as seamless, friction-free surface. Dashboards, drone imagery, and digital twins produce a politics of speed. Speed itself becomes legitimacy. What moves fast appears to be efficient, inevitable, modern. But in visual regime, displacement, ecological loss, and informal economies disappear from the view. Velocity governs what is seen and what is rendered invisible. On the ground, corridor urbanism has tangible consequences. Land acquisition under LARR is increasingly justified through national importance. Agricultural belts become logistical surfaces. Rivers, forests, and wetlands are reduced to constraints in clearance documents. For residents, this produces fragmented settlements and long distance mobility without urban citizenship. People move faster, but they belong less. Importantly, this rescaling is contested. We see resistance through PILs, NGT interventions, counter mapping, and long standing movements like Narmada Bachao Andolan and Konkan coastal mobilizations. But resistance is uneven. Some projects are delayed, some are redesigned, many proceed without minor concessions. The point is not romantic success, but that scale itself has become the terrain of struggle. To conclude, this paper argues that scale is now a primary political battleground in urban India. Corridors centralize authority while hollowing the democratic space. Planning gives way to logistics as the dominant spatial logic. And challenge ahead is not rejecting infrastructure, but de democratizing the scale and reimagining infrastructure as care, repair, and inclusion, not only control. Thank you. I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Anchita. I would now like to invite Christopher and Yogita. Their paper is titled Contested Waters, Repairing and Unmapping Infrastructures in Delhi's Peripheral Settlements.
Hello all, I'm Yogita and our presentation is titled Contested Waters, Repairing and Unmapping Infrastructures in Delhi's Peripheral Settlements. Delhi's water crisis is in fact multifaceted. As we can see, the different regions of Delhi receive different amounts of water, and in units of LPCD, we see certain areas of Delhi, such as the NDMC and the cantonment area, receiving waters of close to 300 LPCD and sometimes even more, while on the other hand, there are certain other parts of Delhi which receive close to 30. For instance, Narela is one such area, and Mehrauli is one another area in the north and the south of the Delhi, respectively, where we see less than 10 LPCD of waters being supplied. And so there exists a difference of close to 10 times when it comes to the official water which is being supplied by the Delhi Jal Board, which is the nodal agency managing water in the case of Delhi. While on the one hand, this is a generalization to say that these parts of Delhi receive this much amount of water, we see that even within these larger areas, there are certain pockets and clusters which do not receive so much of water. And particularly, these are the JJ clusters as well as some of the unauthorized colonies, which do not receive so much of water on account of the fact that they're not officially connected to the centralized piped water supply system managed by the Delhi Jal Board. And one of the important reasons of why this happens is because of the land status. Because they lack official property documents and official property ownership documents in the first place, does the DJP not provide them with the official pipe water supply for the fear that these are spaces which might get demolished at any point of time? And so investing financially in these areas makes less sense for them. And so we see that decades and decades continue. However, the provision of piped water supply to these areas seems to be always in a perpetual lacking. However, water being so important, citizens are forced to rely on water through other means, whether it's through tube wells, whether it's through bore wells, whether it's through tankers, both government as well as private, citizens and residents rely on these water sources in order to fulfill their daily needs and requirements. And as a result of which, there exists an archipelago of water supply with respect to how citizens procure these water, as well as how both government as well as private actors play an important role in supplying water to these areas. However, with this diversity of water resources also comes a compromise in terms of the water quality that the citizens receive. A lot of borewell waters that the citizens procure are either through investments that have made on their own, and as a result of which they do not do regular water quality checks. However, the taste of water and the color of water is tells a lot. So when we'll come to our field specific case study, we'll discuss how the color and the taste of water is not good enough, and especially with the borewell water which is procured through the residents in the specific site where they live in. And so all of the water that is supplied in these 20-30 rupees Bisleri cans, or through other private tankers which operate in these areas, do not serve to be do not are not standard water quality measures if one checks at them. All of this crisis in Delhi has been partly on account of the fact that Delhi, as we all know, does not have its own water resources uh, in the adequate measure. So Delhi, the major sources of water in Delhi are either the groundwater or the river Yamuna, and which is not enough for the rising and large population of Delhi. We see that the state is relying on other neighboring states to procure water for its everyday needs, and it is through these means that it secures water. In addition to this, we also see that over years there has been a decline in the groundwater levels, and as a result of which, this discourse of what there existing a water scarcity, which is true, gets all the more circulated and hegemonized because of the fact of its constant circulation, especially during the summer months. As a result of which, the citizens also, in a way, compromise on their daily water needs, the quality of water that they get, because there is this constant repetition of the idea that we don't really have enough water in the first place. Thus, there have been bodies and rules and regulations which have been controlling groundwater, and groundwater, though, is not such a dominant mode of water supply as we get to hear in the official policy documents, which relies and talks more about the piped water supply. But in case of Delhi, we see that groundwater forms a really important part in the water resource basket that citizens have to secure and fulfill their basic water needs. And there have been regulations by the central government as well as the Delhi state government to regulate water. And however, there still continues to be certain loopholes in terms of the way it's implemented. There have been ceilings of bore wells and things of that sort, which happen almost every year, at least for the past few years. But we see that there's still a growing private water market which is operating in Delhi, which in a way fulfills the needs of the citizens at times, but maybe at times also contributes to the unregulated water crisis which is presently operating in Delhi. Can we move to the next slide, please? Yeah. So now coming on to the methods, we've done close to 15 months of cumulative ethnographic work in two camps called as the Indar camp and the Nala camp, which are small clusters within Rangpuri Pahadi, which lies in the southwest district of Delhi. As part of our field data collection methods, we've used semi structured interviews, and these are interviews that we've conducted with the community leaders, the borewell operators who are the residents of this area, the usual residents of the area, as well as the civil society organizations and government officials in the MCD department, as well as the DUSIB. In addition to this, we've analyzed some of the policy documents, both government as well as other research organizations working in working in sectors of water and sanitation in Rangpuri Pahadi. The picture that is shown here is just outside of a DUSIB center of Nala camp. Can we move to the next slide? Yeah. So Rangpuri Pahadi, as I just mentioned, is a JJ cluster which lies informally and liminally between two well-known spaces of Delhi, which is Mahipalpur and Vasant Kunj. It's very close to the Delhi airport, in fact. And the settlement when it started was during times of colonial rule in India, and mining and stone quarrying was the predominant activity. And the settlement sort of houses a lot of migrants from the neighboring states as well as faraway states of India. And the last census that we had, we the area recorded of a population of more than 5,000 residents, and it's been only growing since then. The people who live here work in the informal economy of Delhi, predominantly as construction workers, domestic workers, drivers, gardeners in the airport, and other offices and hotels nearby. The area is on lands which belong to the DDA as well as the Forest Department, parts of it under DDA and parts of it under the Forest Department. And there's been an ongoing court case also. So uh, there is a dispute with respect to the land ownership status of this area. There are close to five JJ clusters, and they are in the Israel camp, Indar camp, Nala camp, Masjid camp, as well as Hoti camp. So these are five clusters, and we've been in this presentation. We are just focusing on two of them. One is the Indar camp, the other is the Nala camp. As far as the water supply in this area is concerned, we see that there is no piped water supply in any form, nor has there been any attempt to install that in this area uh, ever before. The water that the citizens procure is through either the bore wells or it's through the tankers. The tankers that operate here are both again the private as well as the government. The government tankers are very irregular. They have to be booked if each time water is required. So there's this group of households which books water tankers, and that is how the water comes in. There are a lot of factors which play in at the level of the water disbursing station. So once they have enough water and they feel that water inadequate amount can be supplied, only it is then that the water is supplied. So it's not as if one makes the booking and has been assured that the water would be supplied. It's dependent on a host of other factors that they would be getting water in the first place. And apart from this, apart from the government tankers, there are also private tankers which operate private water plants which operate in the area. So close to Rangpuri Pahadi, there's this Rangpuri village, which is where a lot of the RO water plants operate. Almost all the RO water plant owners or workers that we've talked to have admitted to the fact that all of these are not legal in the first place, but because of the political connections that they have and because of certain negotiations that they are able to make, they are able to supply water to the residents and make money out of it as well. In addition to the tanker water, there's this borewell water which is operating also within the settlement. So these are borewells which have been here for quite a while now, and it's being managed by the residents themselves, who give the keys and the responsibility to a borewell operator who's also a resident from the area only. This borewell operator, a lot of them who we talked to, we came across that these are people who are well connected to, or at least good relatives with, the people who are politically influential in the area. And so this is how the responsibility of managing the water gets distributed. A lot of water that is being distributed here follows not the need, but the pattern is that you give 20 minutes or 30 minutes of water, and based on that time you charge people the amount that you're charging. So generally for 20 to 30 minutes of water, the charge is 300. It varies between 300 to 400 rupees a month, and it changes according to the season also. This money that is given to them, it's used only for the purpose of like giving the electricity bills, and if there's any repair work that is to be done, it's again something which is funded by the community members themselves. And so this is how the borewells operate in this area. The borewell operators are given the work in shifts, and so there's this for close to 9 hours, 10 hours of shift they have. And then these are also not very well paid jobs, but they get close to say 8,000 to 10,000 rupees a month. But it's enough for them, because they feel, even after investing so much of time in the management of water, they feel that there's no work, they just have to like push the levers. And so this is something that they don't really have a problem working for. And this is with respect to the water supply that's being done. When I tasted the water, and I also asked the residents of the quality of the borewell water that is being dug out from their settlements, they say that because of the sanitation condition of the settlement, the water quality there is also not so good. And so they don't use that water, they don't consume that water, and neither do they use it for cooking, but it's used for other household chores of say cleaning, washing, etc. The water that they drink is mostly the tanker water, which is the DJB water, or the private water that they get in the 20 or 30 rupees distillery cans. So this is how the people or the residents fulfill their water needs. And here it's the groundwater which becomes really, really central in terms of water consumption that they do, as well as the other uses that they uh, have of water. This is where I end. Chris can take over from now.
Yeah, so in this particular context, what we aim to do is think about water supply in this area in the context of both the idea of repair and unmapping. So what we are aiming to do here is think about how these water access practices, and particularly how they have evolved over time, was in an incremental fashion and without a long-term future in mind. So repair has been introduced into the urban studies literature to examine or to look at how different practices of infrastructure, of housing, of changing the physical environment that one lives in and inhabits in can be incremental, can be done in such a way that one is getting by, one is making a life worth living and able to be lived in the particular situation that they are in. And then unmapping here points more towards the governance aspect, towards how a lack of overt state knowledge in a particular situation can create a state of exception in which government agencies or entities can arbitrarily or otherwise take decisions that allow them to change circumstances on the ground without, and this is in contrast to general ideas of governments which are formed around knowledge production and knowledge creation, and this is a way of looking at ways in which the state or government might intentionally not know in a particular situation. So then if we look at this particular locality, what Yukita mentioned about the water supply, how it is currently reliant on bore wells, there's an aspect of the evolution of this that we want to look at too. So previously, maybe around 30, 40 years ago, water supply in this area was primarily through wells. This evolved to communal hand pumps, which were often installed with support from MLAs or other government officials. And then this changed to motorized bore wells, which then have subsequently led to community level piped water infrastructure, small scale community managed. But crucially, this was not due to some large scale infrastructural imaginary of household taps, of convenient supply, but rather due to declining groundwater levels in this area, increasing population, and thus these small improvements over time, from a well to a hand pump to installing a bore well to then putting in the piped water system, all done to simply to maintain the existing level of water supply, as opposed to increasing the convenience or trying to align with some idea of what water supply should be in an urban area. And then, as Yogita also mentioned, as if we look at the diversity of sources in this area, we have both the bore well water, which is not considered to be drinkable, comes often to a household tap or a tap on a lane. And then we also have commercial bottling plants, in addition to tankers, water that is considered to be drinkable. So groundwater, and particularly if we look at the materiality of groundwater, this enables both this access through these communal bore wells connected to pipe systems, as well as the commercial bottling plants. And what we particularly want to highlight here is how groundwater, its lack of visibility and its dispersed nature, allows for the state, in this case particularly the Delhi Jal Board, to not control it or not govern it as strictly as they otherwise would. These wells, these bore wells, are often known about by officials, either because they installed the initial hand pump, because there was some government or NGO support for the installation of these bore wells. But crucially, even though there have been eviction attempts in these areas in an ongoing court case, there has not been attempts to shut down these bore wells on any large scale. So what we want to highlight here is how the planning regime and how the state intentionally ignores or chooses not to recognize this groundwater extraction here, and how this, along with the political contestations, enable a continued supply of water here, even if it is not a centralized or state supply. Thanks.
Thank you, Christopher and Yogita. Our final paper is titled Judicial Urbanism and the Making of Urban Peripheries, Law, Heritage, and Spatial Governance in India, a case study of Chandigarh. This is by Ruchika Khanna from JNU. Over to you, Ruchika.
Okay. Can you all see the slide?
Yes.
Perfect. Hi, I'm Ruchika. I'm a PhD candidate at the Center for the Study of Law and Governance at JNU. I'm studying core periphery dynamics in relation to aesthetic urbanism in tier 2 Indian cities. And I'm going to start with a question. So, what happens when a city built to represent the future becomes trapped in preserving its own newness? Chandigarh, India's first post colonial planned city, embodies this paradox. It was imagined as a planned break from the colonial city, long assumed to embody the nation's heritage future. Yet, as the montage of headlines on the screen suggests, the 2000s arrived with a strange unease. How could a city which was celebrated as an emblem of Indian modernity failed to secure the UNESCO World Heritage Tag? And this setback became a national embarrassment, which quickly turned into an urban movement mobilized under the banner of Uniting for our Chandigarh, constantly asking who has failed Chandigarh. And one answer kept echoing. The failure was attributed to the city's periphery no longer being in alignment with the 1951 Corbusian plan. But firstly, why does this moment matter? From a researcher's point of view, Chandigarh becomes an interesting site because it unsettles a few common assumptions. First, it complicates this idea that peri-urban scholarship in India or peri-urban laws is a fairly recent concern. We see a lot of work on counter migration, metropolitan spillovers, or census towns. Chandigarh periphery was planned from the 50s to the point that it was narrated as heritage. Second, it challenges the monument-centric heritage laws, as the heritage problem here is framed in spatial terms. Third, as the map on the right indicates, the periphery is administratively divided into three different jurisdictions, which is the Chandigarh, Union Territory, Punjab, and Haryana, each with a distinct relationship to heritage claims. And finally, peri-urban governance studies tend to focus on the bureaucracy, zoning laws. What often gets missed is how other institutions also reorder the periphery. And here I look at the courts in particular. My claim is simple. Chandigarh's periphery was not just a byproduct of an expanding city frame or a metropolitan urbanization. It was always something that was institutionally made through construction and reconstruction of legal boundaries, and it slowly turned the heritage or the idea of heritage into a tool of spatial control. Now, let's unpack how this happened. To briefly understand how heritage ends up at the periphery, we need to take a step back to Chandigarh's founding moment. A bureaucrat in the Department of Urban Planning referred to the city as a modern heritage city. Now, that phrase sounds contradictory, but it captures the city's founding logic. It was an urban project where, from the beginning, the past was constructed, it wasn't remembered, to curate a forward looking imaginary. And we actually see this logic play out clearly in the periphery, which was planned through an expert state nexus, what presently Smith terms an authorized heritage discourse. The periphery's future was legally fixed through India's earliest peri-urban law, which was the Punjab New Capital Periphery Control Act, which froze an 8 and then later a 16-kilometer greenbelt as national heritage. Yet, ironically, the periphery lost its original purpose not in opposition to heritage, but through it. Now, how did that happen? Chandigarh's story is less about one plan, it is more about the tensions produced by two separate legal orders. On the left, we see a Corbusian imagination, where the periphery was not seen as an extra land, but part of the city's visual logic. It was a protective edge that treated heritage as form. On the right, we see the Indian administration's imagination. The vocabulary uses the exact same terms of order, but the purpose shifts. So the periphery here was seen as a working buffer meant to contain spillover and manage growth, treating heritage as function. Now, and this is key, both of these logics get pulled into the same legal act. One can actually see the contrary intents on the screen, both are from the same act. But through these, and both of these, through this law, promise protection without ever settling what the periphery was for. So it doesn't resource the tension, it institutionalized it, creating a sort of productive ambiguity where we come forward with this idea of a legal hope of stability with room to keep defining what this stability meant. Now, coming back to the early 2000s, Chandigarh's UNESCO failure was quickly pinned on the bureaucracy for exploiting this very ambiguity in the periphery law. Obviously, there were other issues as well, which were pointed to the governance system, that the problem of too many approvals, there was no clear sequencing, or the ASI's monument centric lens, which was not really built to see a planned city also its heritage, and the three different jurisdictional points that I just mentioned. And this gave way to Save Chandigarh movements, where people turned to a seemingly quiet institution, the judiciary. We would actually find that it was not as quiet. Once the court enters the picture, the question becomes what exactly does the judiciary do to or do for the periphery? To answer that, I extend Gautam Bhan's idea of judicial urbanism to the Chandigarh periphery, where courts didn't merely settle disputes, they actively shaped these peripheral futures by using heritage itself as a legal tactic. So this involves rewording, and even reconstituting urban history through legal procedures over time to shape peri-urban form and migration. Methodologically, the paper combines a SCAD approach with critical legal historiography. SCAD basically tracks how judgments themselves produce knowledge, particularly problem definitions and rationalities, which were geared towards stabilizing heritage. Further, two SCAD informed techniques also guide this analysis. I term these as seeing the judiciary, basically, where the court is seen as an arena where contrary imaginaries are voiced and also assembled by different court files, and seeing like the judiciary, basically, where courts create its own authorized heritage discourses through its own processes. Empirically, I analyzed 100 cases between the Supreme Court and the Chandigarh High Court, tracing this dynamic back to the 60s. Um, so in the 60s and 70s, most legal disputes were filed by displaced villagers that were forcefully asked to move to make way for the city of Chandigarh. The courtroom actually became a meeting point of two key imaginaries. So there were the planners, which were defending the modernist form of the city. Then there were the peripheral residents, which were disputing what actually counts as public interest. And here the periphery was mainly legible through like boundary notifications, particularly Section 4 and 12 notices of the Act and demolition records. In its technique, the court actually insisted that planning authorities are actually not above constitutional limits. Its sharpest move was actually striking Section 12 of the Act, which allowed, say, the deputy commissioner to have unfettered demolition power, and that was termed as unconstitutional. And while there was procedural scrutiny, which did limit arbitrariness, spatially it recast the periphery as a rural frontier. And over time, even urbanizing extensions, as you can say, like vernacular marketing, normal densification, incremental building, they were all rendered illegal within the court despite their bureaucratic recognition. In the 90s, the judicial mood shifts. In the liberalization era, the periphery was no longer treated as a rural fringe, but as a land with an urban function, which required continuous regulation. So the courts began to read this periphery act less as an exceptional constraint, but more as a spatial instrument for planned order. The courtroom now became a meeting point of planners and peripheral actors, but now majorly these peripheral actors became smaller industries and informal workers, all of them contesting what actually counts as misuse or encroachment. The notices become more legible now through, say, zoning category notices or permissions and enforcement records. And in its technique, the court actually sidelines heritage. Herein, the Act's legal sanctity was mainly operationalized through an aesthetic administrative ordering, where courts use deeply visual languages. Terms like city beautiful, like carefully architectured, alongside legal vocabularies to justify discipline. The spatial effect was that now orderly looking development was accommodated while the same informal growth like the kabadi store, sawmill, brick kilns, they were rendered illegitimate, and this was done often through adaptive planning vocabularies that referenced the Corbusian intent, the first legal order. By the 2000s, the Chandigarh city was under pressure. So there was rising IT corridors, there was infrastructure expansion and real estate coming in, followed by the double shock of the failed UNESCO heritage bid that we started with and the wider critique of bad globalization. And in this backdrop, the court began speaking now with a sharper interpretative autonomy to know which no longer was just reviewing administration and administration's decisions, but it was deciding what actually counts as legitimate peri-urbanization. So the courtroom now becomes a very crowded meeting point with RWAs, preservationists, developers, of course, peri-urban villagers, and the state agencies of all the three states. The periphery now appears in court files more in terms of the acquisition files, the policy reviews or master plan reviews, and the heritage anxiety was mainly discussed now through the meanings of unauthorized, what constitutes the unauthorized. And regarding the technique, we see three more standouts. So the Periphery Act is upheld to block bureaucratic leniency, which decided to retreat the Corbusian plan as an enforceable heritage doctrine. Second was the same aesthetic categories of visual harmony, character, disfiguration, unesthetic structures. We see these terms all over the laws or the cases actually that you see on the screen. They all became judicial tests in themselves. And the court, we see, adopted flexible legalism, stating that today's unauthorized would be tomorrow's authorized, but insisted that this transition needed to be judicially supervised. In the 2010s, the heritage is actually no longer just a sentiment. It actually hardens now in an institutional regime with the establishment of the Chandigarh Heritage Conservation Committee, and this was a result of a court order. The court actually now becomes a meeting point for the same agencies, but now all of them were arguing meanings of heritage using land density and infrastructure as frames. In its technique, the court actually shifts from deference to a more adversarial scrutiny. So they quashed land speculation attempts, which was the key one being the Nangar city land transfers and the arbitrary boundary changes, which the three states kept on doing, and demanded procedural transparency from the bureaucracy. And at the same time, it itself installed a core fringe duality. akin to the modern architecture movement that framed heritage as a norm setting technique to guide spatiality. So we actually see the sectors 1 to 30, they were treated as sacrosanct, cue the apartmentalization case that we see, while the periphery was allowed now to functionally expand only if it mimicked the Corbusian regime. Post 2021, Chandigarh city region was reorganized again by the post-pandemic asset-driven urbanization with the coming in of private capital, gated housing, peripheral expansion rose immensely. And in this moment, the Periphery Control Act was increasingly treated as a legacy planning law, which was managed along other wider legal regimes. So now RERA, Consumer and Fora started entering the frame, rather than the singular heritage aesthetic that we see in the previous phases. I attended multiple hearings from 2022 onwards, and the courtroom ethnography showcased a clear shift. There was a move away from the purity of plan stance to enforcement, citing delay records, compliance histories, or environmental claims. And in its technique, the court stance shifted from an anti-state to a more anti-corporate stance. So it did scrutinize state actors, but less on their substance, which at best called out mechanical applications of the act. And at the same time, it helped private developers, especially the new Chandigarh housing societies, to account, enforcing remedies for peri-urban violations now mainly through consumer protection forums. So far, I've shown heritage as like a top-down technology of control, but in the hearings I sat through and in the conversations I had after the court, we also kept hearing something else. Peri-urban residents in themselves also started using heritage as a negotiating tactic, a way to speak in the language to the state and the courts because they were willing to hear in those language. I take the peripheral town of Mani Majra as a case study to show this. It is an interstitial zone. It predates Chandigarh, used to be a capital of around 84 villages historically, and it actually sits neither fully inside the planned grid and it is not also entirely outside the regulatory imagination of the space. What is striking is that we see both legal orders visible here. So, firstly, historically, it actually appeared in Corbusier's own sketches as part of the rural landscape. Its water pools were inspirations behind the water pools that we see in the Capitol complex and at the Punjab University. And second, a 1957 Punjab Gazette discusses actively shifting commercial activity from the space of Mani Majra to, say, earlier Sector 22 and then later Sector 17, reducing it to a labor reserve for the core city. On ground, Mani Majra feels like it's split into two towns. We have the Mani Majra old and the Mani Majra new. This is what people themselves call it on the ground. The new kind of marks the state's re-densification project. It was a result of a state's re-densification project, which is mainly mid-rise flats constructed for the middle class. While the old kind of became the receiving ground for what Chandigarh wanted to push out. So all the rehabilitated slums, whatever they considered anesthetic, whatever the markets that they didn't need, etc. And correspondingly, Mani Majra's own heritage controversies sharpened over time. Basically, there were demands to be recognized as part of Chandigarh's heritage by being brought into the official sectoral grid. So, my fieldwork shows the residents themselves using heritage as a negotiating tactic to either advance or resist this incorporation. So on one side, we had the affluent enclave of, say, the NAC, the modern housing complex, Shivalik enclave, Uppals, and which argued that the sectoral incorporation would bring in the Corbusian order that the city was now missing. Here, the heritage becomes a claim to recognition, urban services, and property value. Basically, the idea being we look and we live like the grid or the core Chandigarh, so include us within it. And on the other side, long-time residents, especially around the fort area, were resisting assimilation. So they were mobilizing people around different ideas of an heritage, which is that they predate Chandigarh, so they're different. Second, the global visibility that they got, especially after the filming of Zero Dark 30, which was uh, an Oscar nominated movie. So they all said that our heritage is now older and it's different, so it cannot really be flattened into the Corbusian template. However, in February 2020, Mani Majra was actually redesignated as Sector 13, and we see in very recently by July 2025 that mass demolitions have followed in this space explicitly to make it look like the ordered Chandigarh. Residents are acutely aware of how this heritage discourse is being used to legitimize such spatial interventions and exclusion. As we speak, the struggle between these two legal logics is still unfolding, and it actually remains an unconcluded story. I'm going to end with this summary slide, and I look forward to interacting with you all. Thank you.
Thanks, Ruchika. Thank you to all the presenters for a really nice set of papers. We are going to open it up for questions and answers now. And folks who have joined us online, if you have questions, please use the Q&A box to add your questions. Anshika, thank you for the really nice presentation on corridors. And we've really seen the kind of mega infrastructure development that is happening across the country, right? We started with the DMIC, and we now have 11 corridors in different various stages of development. I wanted to understand, and you use a really nice phrase saying we need to build corridors of care. I wanted to know, what do you think that looks like? How do we operationalize something like that? How do we build corridors of care?
As I said, that LARR, the day it was put in place, there is a very good term in it called national importance. And I have marked that out in my presentation as well, that whenever they intend to build or intend to execute something of the scale of corridor or something as aspirational as a mega infrastructure project, they, tackle the term of uh, national importance very well and just overrule the economy that exists in that place, and the ecology that exists in that place, and the sense of belonging, the spatial setting that uh, exists in a smaller scale. While such kind of projects are imagined, we need to carefully understand and address the spatial logic of that economy, of that ecology, and that sense of belongingness. And if we are able to address that, then we can build corridors of care.
Thanks, Anshika. I also had a follow-up question where, through your projects, I was curious to know what is the kind of local resistance that you may have seen given in the cases of these corridors? Because we know we have large sort of agricultural tracts of land which are being taken away to build
Mm.
these mega infrastructure projects. So a little bit on your fieldwork and what is the kind of resistance that you might have seen from the local folks there?
Ma'am, as far as agricultural land is concerned, the resistance is not usually addressed. They are not able to fight it well. They do file cases. They keep fighting to the authorities, but obviously, given the fact of the scale of the project, they lose. The cases which only come to our notice are the ones which are of greater environmental importance and are helped, or maybe taken over by NGT. So I'd say there is this particular case of rivers in the district that I live. So NGT has been actively taking up that. If something, I means if institutions of that scale as good as NGT pick up the cases, then they maybe gain some visibility, or they gain some kind of importance by other people also, and support by other people also. Otherwise, for agricultural lands, people only cry about it and never get justice. That is what brought me, it just kept me awake for a few days, seeing that happening on field. And that's how I felt that this should be written and brought to notice of people.
Thanks, Anchika. Christopher and Yogita, I wanted to ask that you've done a lot of ethnographic fieldwork of about 15 months in these settlements. I wanted to know a little bit about the lived experiences of these people and how they negotiate their daily lives of repair, unmapping, and their relationships with the government over there.
So with respect to the lived experience, it's gradually been changing. So yeah, the even with so there are two levels actually. So one is that the as and when the political parties and leaders change, the small sense of trust building that they had with the borewell operators over these 3, 4, 5 years, that sort of changes, because the new borewell operator will be a person who will belong to the new political party, and maybe at times the intercommunity dynamics of whatsoever is the case with at the family level or the individual level, that also plays out in the amount of water that they get. So maybe at times they would not get that much quantity of water which they were getting earlier. So with and these are challenges which they encounter with respect to the borewell water. Similarly, with the tanker water, there is a person who manages the tanker water at this place, who does all the bookings and all. And based on your personal experience, your individual and family a relationship with that person, you also get the water that you get. So maybe you are not allowed to have two connections, but if you have good relationships with the person, you might have a chance that you would have two connections. So these micro level relationships that they have, like what the residents have, determines to a large extent the experience and the cost that they put into securing the water in the first place. If that's not done, they have to buy the water, and so it costs them a little more in the absence of these relationships.
I have a question to Christopher and Yogita as well. I was actually really interested to hear, the discourse around sort of almost what you were saying, the manufactured scarcity of water in some ways. And I find that really interesting, particularly because there's a lot of conversation and also evidence to show that we are exploiting, our sort of freshwater resources, etc., particularly groundwater. And I wanted to sort of hear a little bit more about sort of what you were saying about the management of groundwater itself and why you thought that it actually wasn't sort of this narrative of scarcity that's being built, from what I understood, isn't really kind of the story on the ground, really, but it's a kind of manufactured crisis around water in some ways. And I just wanted to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I guess I wouldn't say that it's a manufactured crisis fully, but I think it's important to look at how the discourse around water scarcity is constructed in this particular context, in the sense that groundwater levels are declining throughout the city and declining particularly in South Delhi. But even though over the past 2 or 3 years specifically, they have began to recover somewhat. And so there is some changing dynamics there. And then there's also looking at who is allowed to continue to extract groundwater. I mean, a lot of like scenic farms and other very wealthy South Delhi neighborhoods are primarily reliant on groundwater, and these bore wells are very rarely shut down. Whereas the discourse is, especially in the media, is predominantly focused on the water mafia, water tankers, bottle suppliers, etc. So I think it's not necessarily making a factual claim about the status of groundwater in Delhi, but more looking at what certain discourses surrounding that do and who is allowed to or not allowed to extract groundwater and in what ways.
I think there are a couple of questions here. Yeah.
Thanks a lot for those papers. I had two questions, one for Ruchika and one for Yogita and Christopher. Ruchika, thanks. It was a fascinating paper. Really, really nice work, very nicely presented. And I actually just wanted you to say more about in your slides in the middle column, you had this thing about the file, and the file became different things. And I just wanted you to say more a little bit about that file, because I think a lot of times when you think about the relationship of statecraft between the government and the executive, it is objects like the file that are both judicial and governmental. You know, that they exist in a way, they have authority in both arms of the state. And you had this notion of the file as a contestation in the beginning, but an archive by the end. And I just thought it was really interesting. So if you could just say more about the file as an object, and also what that does methodologically. Because one of the things that are very hard to get to is files, government orders. And I say this also because so much of the fights around the amendments to the Right to Information Act were whether we had a right to see the the notes that officers made on the margins of files, right? And you know this in your work. And when those notes were excluded from RTI, we could see what was typed, or we could not see what the officer wrote on the side. And so I'm just thinking about the file as as a site on an archive of statecraft, and whether the file is a judicial object or an executive object or both, and what that allows us to say. So that was one thing. And the second thing I just as a little push to you, because of how thick the work is, just to think a little bit or of what work it does to classify what you have, your divisions, chronologically by years, because there's a sort of strange clarity on it, 90 to 2000, 2000 to 2010. And I think it's odd because there is a kind of flow in the divisions, but the periodization almost suggests a linearity, right? It's not like the earlier logics from the 90s vanished in the 2010s, right? So just to think about whether that division is a categorical one, an epistemological one, or is it actually a chronological one? Like, what is time doing for you there? I didn't know what to do with it, so I thought I'd just ask you why you chose to make it chronological. But thanks again. It was a very, very nice paper, and very compellingly presented. Christopher and Yogita, I wanted to ask you on if the infrastructure is not just materially incrementally built, right, but politically incrementally negotiated. So, I mean, that's part of the argument of the assemblage, which is that going from a bore well to a tap is not about technology or money. It is about the political opportunity when you know you can get away with it, right? Because everyone knows how to make a community tap, but you do the bore well because you haven't yet got the political agreement to get away with it, right? Or the structure. So I was just thinking about, could we then not use repair conceptually, not just about the physical pipe and bore well, but actually about the repair of a political relation? Right? That you have a state-citizen relation that is incomplete and you have to repair it. It's not completely broken because the state does let you keep getting away with things, right? It does let you be there, but it's also not secure because it doesn't give you your rights. So it's that, and so what would it mean to think of infrastructural repair not as a material practice, but actually also as a practice of repairing the political state-citizen relation that then allows the materiality to basically be unleashed? Because because the settlement from the very beginning could have built the pipes and the tap. There is no missing knowledge here. There is just missing opportunity. So when we use repair with infrastructure, are we actually repairing citizenship more than we're repairing infrastructure? So how does repair move to that assemblage? And again, thanks for the paper.
Ruchika, I think you can respond first, and then Yogita and Christopher.
Thank you. So the first question that Sir asked me was in relation to the file. And he's absolutely right because I did file an RTI to access those files, but I could not say get a copy of what the statements or comments of the people are on it. I couldn't scan it, but you can actually sit on ground with the bureaucracy, which I did for months on at a stretch, to actually read bit by bit which cases eventually ended up going to the court. So I try to make that connect, and you can actually very interestingly find similar arguments that he made, and he actually summarized it much better than how it actually became, like, from contestation it actually just became an archive, because earlier the documents or the files that were submitted from the court or from the executive, as well as who would come to the court, and the say the peri-urban inhabitant who was disputing the claim, they would actually have a more detailed account of what, say, the issue is and how different levels the file has moved and the different comments that they have. And over time, if you'd see the more recent file, they just ask the executive to submit a smaller note, which, so the nuance of that argument kind of changes. And if you would actually sit through the court, you would see the nuance better. So I found more nuanced, say, stances in the earlier, like, 1990s, 2000s, but there was a period when the small note started, I couldn't see those arguments, so I had to trace those arguments back to the um, bureaucracy and see level by level that they go. You can't scan it, but you can sit and tediously read through it to come to a conclusion. And you're absolutely right. Probably this is also like a form of legal training that you are see or organize cases chronologically. That's just how the court would also throw the data at you. That is something I do need to think about. And while you were saying that, there are a few kind of tactics or frames that I saw the court constantly using. One would be treating the 1951 plan as fixed. There was constant idea of adaptive reuse by referencing Corbusian intent. There was this whole idea that we need to also mobilize transnational urban imaginaries the moment UNESCO started getting involved or coming in. This constant invocation of this is necessary and this is more pragmatic, we need to do that. And lastly, there's always this selective retrieval of Corbusian kind of objectives where he says he was in favor of building like long buildings. We can now use that intent. Pehle we didn't really have like the money to do all of those things. I think that is something I still need to think about, probably in terms of how it could be presented better, and maybe the chronology is taking away the nuance in a bit. And you're right, all of these five strategies that I just voiced keep coming and going in different cases. They don't just vanish. So yeah, thank you. I would take that feedback.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with what Sir just said of how repair is not just the repair of infrastructure, but a negotiation, a constant negotiation with the political relationship that the citizens and the community people have with whosoever is the one managing the water. When it started earlier, the settlement, it was the contractor who was managing the water, and so that was the relationship which became important. But over time, yes, the different politicians at the local level were ones which become important, and it is through this political negotiation that the material conditions also took shape in the settlement, and vice versa also through an enactment of these material claims or these borewells and taps, etc. They sort of started claiming a form of citizenship. So yeah, I mean, yeah.
I would almost push back on the idea that it is a repair of citizenship in this sense. I mean, I do think that there is a political aspect to it and an aspect of negotiations, but I also think that it might be helpful to also look at or think about this situation as a state of exception or as something almost outside of citizenship. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily think of it as repairing a state citizen relationship that is damaged or otherwise not fulfilling the community's needs, simply to have this type of incremental infrastructural arrangements in this area. I mean, I think that it it almost seems too hopeful to call it a repair of citizenship, particularly given the continuing battles over eviction here. If you go and talk to people here, I mean, one of the biggest issues is drains, even more so than water. And the lieutenant governor visited in 2024. I think the chief minister visited the area last year, and there still is no change in the material circumstances there. So I think that while these relationships are important to highlight, I do think that it's important to not be too optimistic in how we view the changes that have occurred there.
Thanks, Christopher and Yogita. I think there are a couple of questions more. So I think we'll just take one round of questions and then the panelists can respond.
No, I was just saying I really enjoyed the presentations in Ruchika. It's really fascinating. Because but I think one of my questions has already been addressed in terms of the linearity of chronological and what that does in terms of how we imagine a certain kind of progression towards something, right? But I think you've already spoken about that. My other question was about the idea of heritage. And I think we tend to think like, so heritage is coming across as something that is apolitical, and secondly is very material, right? Because you're working within the shadows of this Corbusian architecture. But I'm also wondering whether there are, coming from that, but is there a way of thinking about heritage that is more lively, that is information that is being created in relationship to these material and political mobilizations, right? And I was wondering, and because it is a city, it's a lively city, the city is growing, it's also changing in relationship to its architecture. I'm wondering whether there is a way of kind of thinking of heritage in relation to those as well. And I don't know if it's relevant to your work, but it's just something that I was thinking about. For Yogita, I wanted to ask how you both arrived at the sort of vocabulary of unmapping and of repair, and whether there were also other words, right, other ways of thinking about what's happening that you perhaps discarded or didn't move forward with. So I was a bit curious, and I think it's also because like repair is something that's physical, right? It's something that you are doing. It's material in the sense that you're fixing it, so that you're constantly fixing. But repair also has a certain weight, right? It has a certain conceptual weight, and I'm wondering whether that like I'm wondering whether that kind of how should you sort of are looking at these different ways of the vocabulary or different ways of understanding or mobilizing the vocabulary that you use. And similarly with mapping and unmapping, because the second you say unmapping, I think of mapping, and then I think about whether there's a certain central absence, right? That becomes it becomes like the absent other when you're talking. So are we always kind of constantly talking about water in relationship to a certain centralized system of a certain kind of mapping, and hence there is an unmapping? So I was just wondering if you talk a bit more about those words. Sorry if that was too long.
I think we'll take a couple more questions that were here. I think he's going and then you can go.
I was just wondering, Yogita, did you have interactions with DUSIP as well as part of I mean, did the people have negotiations with DUSIP as well other than Delhi Jal Board? And how does it, how do you see it in terms of scale? And did they have engagements with departments in the central government? So, in terms of scale, how does that power negotiation happen? I guess I'll keep it to that.
You had a question?
Very interesting presentations. I have two speculative provocations for Ruchika and Christopher and Yoga. In case of Chandigarh, because there isn't a political executive other than the municipal corporation, does that play a role in this negotiation? Because otherwise, in normal circumstances, for most other Indian cities, there would be another layer where this could happen. That's one. And for Christopher and Yogita, in Delhi's case, I think in terms of network infrastructure, beginning of the century, there was privatization. Electricity was one where I think similar relationship existed in case of Delhi Vidyut Board. But since the privatization, both the access to service and the scope for political negotiation has gone away. DJB was also going through that with the World Bank funded project, which never happened. Do you think in this context, is there a scope? And if it had happened or it might happen, how do you see the scope for political negotiation, especially in these settlements? Thank you.
Thanks. Ruchika, I think you can respond to the first two questions and then Christopher and Yogita.
So the first question was basically about people's relation to the architecture. Um, So, firstly, Chandigarh actually becomes a unique spot because legally it is not considered heritage in Indian heritage law, which is why they keep moving in international frames because they align better with, sadly, the UNESCO or the ICOSMOS understandings of it. Um, if you were to actually read through Chandigarh's history, also going back to the time when it was even being conceived, from say Nehru's to then the other people who actually came forward, the imaginary was very less monument centric. It was always about what, say, contemporarily we call heritage urbanism and critical heritage studies frame, where they treated how the space looked, its grid feature, the fact that it has gold checkers, the fact that roads are organized in the V7 line format, the fact that it is either a radio concentric city or not. Those imaginaries became or what they understood as heritage over time since 2016, since UNESCO only offered the capital complex the heritage tag, the heritage imaginary even in people's mind when you talk on the ground has reduced to a more monument centric view. A lot of this is also to do with heritage tourism, since Chandigarh gets very less funding, say, from the center with regard to heritage preservation and all of those other kinds of fundings, they had to look towards alternative imaginaries. And when they actually filed their first, say, heritage claim or heritage bid, they had actually filed it on the entire Chandigarh plan, which is why they also failed because the periphery, as I said, started looking a little different from what the earlier or imagination was of the space. Um, have I answered your question completely? Is there something you want to add to that?
I mean, yeah. I think I was. I think to some degree, yes, but I'm also wondering whether, because, when we think about heritage, there's a certain relationship to the past, and I'm wondering how that gets activated in more lively forms in the current, including in the legal documents that you're reading, right? So I think more than sort of like the sort of historical significance and the idea of heritage and like the city and how it's constructed and how people relate to it, I'm trying to understand how heritage becomes a sort of lively idea, but even in the present and in the ways in which legal and judicial documents that you're reading, if at all they reflect that. Or is it something that we think of only in relationship to the past?
So, first of all, you would actually find this is very interesting because in Chandigarh document, you would actually find an overt acceptance that the past here is constructed. And that is something that has been consistently also contested from the periphery because they argue that the past, there was always a past in the space. You actually pushed people who used to live in that spot to the now what has now become the periphery. So you ask them to move out so you could construct a heritage in that space. So you could possibly see the histories of, say, a lot around 50 villages or whatever that were moved. On record, you'd actually find 22 of them, or in some you would find 50. A lot of them have now started voicing their own histories simply because the state is now slowly, as they say, trying to encroach on their heritage or taking that in within the sectoral grid which they are resisting due to a lot of reason. It's not just about the pride and all those things. A lot of economical reasons also. They have to deal with taxes and just other things that also comes when a space gets becomes a part of statutory governance. Great. Second question was in relation to where is the municipal corporation in this picture. Interestingly, also in Chandigarh, the municipal corporation actually um, does not decide what or how the spatial frame is going to look. It does though become a part of the negotiation. So the field side that I discussed, which was Mani Majra, their key voice of becoming a part of the sectoral grid was initially voiced to the executive. It was rejected. It was then voiced through the municipal corporation over the years. So they did use that as that institution in their negotiation forum, and over time, also due to political reasons, etc., Mani Majra is also, quote unquote, a richer periphery, if you were to say. They were able to get their demands met. And here I'm talking specifically about the new Mani Majra from which this demand actually came. With regard to whether there are other villages on ground who are also using municipal cooperation to get similar forms of negotiations, yes, there is also Kansal, which is the biggest one. Right behind the capital complex, there's also Kemwala, which you can now see from the Sukna Lake. It's right behind it. They were moved to actually make the Sukna Lake. So, yeah, I hope that helps.
Yeah, I guess in terms of the first question, in terms of the vocabulary and whether there are other words that or concepts that could be applicable in these areas, I'm sure that we have come across several that could be. But I do think that you hit on something particularly important when you mentioned the relationship to another, and particularly the centralized system. And I do think that points to an important aspect of why we did choose these terms, in the sense that the imaginary of a centralized system is key to how both people access water, but also how they want to access water in areas like this and throughout the city. And so I think that this imaginary of a centralized system and of connections to a centralized system are very prevalent in this area, even though they do have bore well water and household taps, etc. And I think that's one of the reasons that both repair and unmapping are felt very applicable here, and that it is not a long-term, future-oriented imaginary. It is not the state's centralized planning that is evident here, but rather the alternatives to that, or ways around that. Yogita, do you want to talk a little bit about that, or about the scale and negotiation question regarding DUSIB?
Yeah. So the first question also, the unmapping aspect comes in all the more importantly because with respect to the land status of this area also, we've seen historically how it's shifted from a census town to a rural village. It's still not classified as an urban village, although we know that there are facilities provided by DUSIB on that ground. So one of the reasons also for choosing unmapping was how this practice itself enables the state to do certain actions without really taking responsibility for having done or not done those actions. And so it, in a sense, captures the presence of certain actions at certain points of time, but not necessarily always being so the case, and not always being a precedent in subsequent instances also. So because it captures really well the flexibility uh, of such things, it becomes important that we thought we'll take it into consideration. With respect to the interaction with DUSIB, DJB, MLAs, etc., of the residents, DUSIB not really in terms of interacting in person, but yeah, we filed a couple of RTIs through to the DUSIB as well as the DJB in order to elicit of the information with respect to the borewells that have been constructed and the funds that they allot per year per month for their maintenance. With respect to the residents and the interaction with the MLAs and the DJB, so we and during our fieldwork encountered that with the MLA there is a lot of interaction. Residents very frequently visit the MLA office about their demands, not just water but other things also. So yes, there has been an interaction with the MLA because a lot of discretionary funds that the MLA has is being used for the upgradation, and so that relation is something which becomes important on and is more frequent in comparison to the interaction with other state officials of the DJB. DJB, the lower level field workers regularly visit these areas. So it's not the JE, but the local field officers with whom is the person with whom the residents sort of interact. And so we've tried to understand that relationship also, but not necessarily with the JE or the AE or the action officer. With respect to the privatization of the Delhi Jal Board, it actually is, although it's not in name, but it still is getting privatized because a lot of these tankers which are operating presently are tankers which are through public-private partnerships. So these are tankers we've been told of business people, of politicians, of ministers, of police officers, and these are tankers, and they have close to 5 tankers operating in different parts of Delhi. So Delhi Jal Board presently, not in name, at least in some form of public-private partnership, is operating. And yes, it shall definitely have ramifications with respect to the water that the residents get, not just in informal settlements, but in other colonies aside also. So, for instance, Vasant Kunj may, whenever there is this water crisis, which was there very recently, is also because the Delhi Jal Board, since the past 10 years, did not have any new recruitments. It's severely understaffed. And this same JE who's running to the Najafgarh office, who's running to the Mahipalpur office, who's running to the Vasant Kunj office. And so, because of this understaffing, it's not just the informal settlements who are facing water scarcity or water crisis or not having repair of infrastructure at proper times, but it's the whole of Delhi which shall definitely, in my opinion, face a problem in the coming future.
Thanks, Yogita. Are there any more questions from the audience?
So I'm just wondering, this whole question of infrastructure as kind of biopolitical, does it also then include the voting mechanism? So there are these two mechanisms that are operating. On the one hand, there is a sort of legalized framework for getting votes. And the other side, you have institutions that are outside that regime of, so there's a sort of political angle and there is the sort of physical infrastructural angle.
We are. So in the recent elections, for that matter, the February elections, which happened last year, there was this borewell which was dug right a week before the elections by the MLA of one of the parties. So yes, elections become really important at the time of infrastructure constructions. And although they might not always be the case, but there have been instances where elections have played an important role in the construction of infrastructure.
Okay, I think we are at time. So thank you, everybody, especially to the panelists and the audience for this really lively discussion. I hope all of you can take insights from this into your research and take it forward.